Here we see some of those creatures. Some of them are still alive today. We have an amoeba with no shell, made of just one cell that did all the work. Here we have some cells with flagellates that move using these two whip-like tails. There's some of the sponges and the seaweeds that did some of the important work in the oceans. One animal, which there was a lot of at this time, were the trilobites. The trilobites are kind of like lobsters, but they no longer exist now. There are many of different sizes and shapes. Some were big, some were small, but they've all now disappeared. As we went on, all different kinds of animals began to appear. All kinds of experiments went on. These creatures were called the cephalopods. They have giant heads with feet on their heads. What an interesting way to develop. We also have some things that look like flowers, but actually weren't flowers. They were stone houses built by jelly-like creatures. They took salts out of the sea to make themselves. Now, some of these things were also called sea lilies. When they died, the trees of rings collapsed and lay at the bottom of the sea, and the water was filled with all these different types of life. Among these were also some creatures who, instead of eating other creatures, made their own food. They did this with the salts of the water and sunlight. They too drifted around the sea, and at some point, some of them decided to see what it was like outside of the sea. Floating with the tides, they got carried to the edge and then remained there until the tides returned. And they found out that the air outside of the water was filled with a gas that they could use to make their food. So they remained there at the edge of the seas, feeding themselves. And when they died, their bodies remained for preparing the grounds for others to come. We also have here, for the first time, life trying out the land. These are some of the ones that developed into plants. While this was going on, around the same time, some animals began to appear in the seas, two new types. One was to help the building of the land, and those were the corals, which you can see. And the next was a special type with a rod in its back. This is the beginning of the vertebrates. It was the beginning of animals with bones. This is around the time those first fish were created. Once this experiment became a success, a great variety of fish appeared. Some were big with great armors for protection. Others would stay buried in the mud and catch other animals as they passed by. Here you can see some of them. Then what happened? Slowly, over a period of time, the land started to rise, and here and there it closed off the seas. And so some of these animals had to experiment with going out onto the land. So here we have some of our first amphibians. Our amphibians learned to breathe outside of the water. And with that then also came some of the first voices on our earth, the frogs croaking. Can you imagine everything being silent except for the sound of falling rocks or rain was finally broken by the arrival of the amphibians on land. Now this was new ground. Now some really wanted to expand and explore further. So they evolved in a way that their skin did not anymore need the water to stay moist. They developed thicker, drier skins. And they developed eggs that had a thicker shell. This was the experiment of some of the reptiles. This was new ground that they were taking on because they could go further and further onto the land since they didn't depend upon the water. There was no one there to stop them, and some of them grew so big. And so we have some of the dinosaurs, which, as we know today, compared to the size of a human, is very, very large. Look at that. Here's another example. The reptiles became the lords and masters of the land, and they were in charge. As time went on, these animals also developed something to keep their skin warm. A new type of animal developed, I should say. And they developed feathers. One of the first is the Archaeopteryx. And what about their eggs? These animals did not want to leave their eggs alone like the reptiles did, so they carried them around inside their bodies. The birds couldn't keep them inside because they had to fly around, so they built nests and sat upon the eggs to keep them warm. While the little ones hatched, they fed and guarded them, sometimes with their lives. Eventually, we get some of the mammals, which kept their little ones inside until they were ready to come out. And the mothers fed them with milk. This was very new, and as the reptiles did not do this, they left their eggs to hatch on their own and figure out life. Once they hatched, they had to figure out things on their own, like I said. But the birds and the mammals, they had developed a new way of caring for their young. But then the weather continued to become colder and colder until large sheets of ice covered the earth, as we see. See an ice age there. We can also see some of them looking back at our timeline. And in the midst of this, something new appeared. It didn't have hair like some of the mammals, nor did it have big teeth or claws, but it had something that none of the others had. It had an enormous amount of love that was so different from any other creature that it was no longer an animal. This was a human being. The special thing about human beings is that our love can go beyond even their own children. It goes to others of their own kind, even to those that they would never, ever see. It was as though that the earth had this long preparation to make way for this special creature. And if the human beings had appeared in any of the previous times, it would not have been possible for them to live. But now everything was ready. It's if the earth had a voice, she would have said, I have spread thick carpets of grass. I have flowers in my hair. My cupboards are filled with milk and honey, meat and vegetables. Down in the cellars, there's coal and iron. Now all has been ready. It is time for you, the human being, to come.